Hello, welcome to Tech Talk Tuesday. I'm your host, Steve Cowles with AEM Test. And today's episode, we have a very special guest with us, Chuck Bowser, RCDD Tech. Welcome, Chuck.
Special ed?
Very special.
Okay.
Welcome to the show, Chuck. Glad you could join us today.
My pleasure. You catch me on my lunch break, and I apologize if I seem kind of preoccupied. I got my show cohort here kind of begging for attention.
Exactly. Well, good lead in there, Chuck, because one of the things that we wanted to do today, we kind of primed the pump and let everybody know that we might have a couple of extra guests. And those of you that have been on the show for a while, you probably noticed that over there on the logo, I've got a dog. And the first episode we had, people started asking, who's the dog? So let me introduce her. Valencia, lap, come on, lap. Yeah. Good girl. So this is Valencia. And Valencia is a lab golden cross. And Valencia is, she was part of the program. Some of you that know me on LinkedIn know that my wife and I raise puppies for a service dog organization. And we get them about 8 weeks of age, and then we have them until they're 18 to 24 months old. We train them, teach them a bunch of stuff, give them back to the organization. And, after they're socialized and learn several commands, and then they put them through professional training. And then at the end of that, they're typically paired up with somebody with a physical disability free of charge. So Valencia was in that program. Our best friends, Gene and Kevin, were her puppy raiser. And then Valencia was released for a mild medical condition that made her ineligible for service. And Gene and Kevin adopted her. So we're over at Gene and Kevin's place right now, and wanted to introduce Valencia. So she's my cohort in the logo there. And just wanted to let everybody know, who she is and what it's all about. So I'm going to go ahead and release her, and then let you talk about who's with you.
What's her nickname? Everybody's got to have a nickname.
V. So, or Princess. So, but Valencia is her name. We call her V for short. Sometimes Princess, because she kind of rules the roost. So
she has more than one, kind of like ours. So let's see if I can get mine. Mine's not going to be as well behaved as yours. Come on. So this is Harley. She is the she appears on quite a bunch of my videos. She's usually on the couch in the back. She's a 9-month-old German Shepherd, and I bought her from a guy who breeds dogs on the side, but his full-time job, telecommunications.
Ah, cool.
Yeah. And a lot of people think she's named Harley because I ride a Harley. Well, kind of, but her predecessor, her name was Sasha Harley. And so we named her after the female that we had before her, out of tribute to our female. So she knows 2 speeds, full throttle, and sleep. And right now she's in full throttle.
So, is she food motivated?
Oh yes, food and ball motivated, either or. She loves to please. She's a great dog for training and stuff. So, but she's a handful.
Cool. Okay, well, I appreciate you bringing her on the show and letting us get to know her a little bit. And that I put the hashtag cable dog in the link for today, so right. Hopefully people caught wind of that. But so I guess we can get to kind of the meat of today's show. We're talking about things that over the last 3 decades or so, you and I have kind of learned, either on our own with some of our experiences in the field, or, especially in my case, there's a lot of stuff that I've just absorbed from all of the professionals I've met over the years, and figured we'd just use the show to kind of talk through some of that, share some of these tips and tricks, and, just to kind of do exactly what your show on Thursday nights does, is to help educate people, and wanted to kind of, bring some of that forward. One thing I'll throw out right away that I learned initially was that when you are getting ready to do a job, check all of your materials before the start of the job. Make sure you got everything right. You don't want, back in the day when we had to order 568A or 568B for the panels and jacks, you want to make sure that both were B or both were A. I've seen situations where that got a job all hosed up. Making sure things like, if you're doing a Cat 6A job, make sure your panels are 6A, your jacks are 6A, everything, those kind of things. And you're making sure you got the right quantities of everything. Just kind of a common sense thing.
it's funny you say that. I did an interview this week. I'm starting another series on my show called Industry Icons, and I'm calling in people that have been around the industry for 20, 30, 40 years and how they impact the industry. And well, I don't want to say who the guest is yet, but that show's coming out in 2 weeks. And that's what we talked about. You have to understand your past to be able to know where you're going, right? And since you guys sell testers, let's get into the heart of the program, right? So a lot of people think tips and tricks for testers. The first tip actually comes before you test the first cable. The first tip is you have to have a good test plan as an organization. And there goes my land shark. She already knocked over one of my studio lamps. I don't know if you saw it go down on me behind me.
That's nice.
Yeah, this is live video, baby. Live video. But so in order to be successful, every company should have a good test plan right out of the gate before they even start testing cables. And the test plan should really cover both training and operationals, right? And I got experience on both sides of this coin, being on the one who's running the tester side and also as a manufacturer looking at test results. So as a part of the test plan, they should really teach their technicians how to set up their testers. And the key critical thing is put the user's name in the tester who's actually doing the testing. Okay, because as a manufacturer, if we have questions, we don't want to talk to the warehouse guy because that's the only person who knows how to update that field, right? And then also you need to make sure that they know how to set up the results. And here's another hot spot too. How do you set up the results so that when you send those test results to the manufacturer for the warranty, you're only sending the test results for that project, not downloading the entire tester to us.
Right.
And that all comes with training. It comes with training. And then on the operational side, what they really need to do is, they need to think about maintaining that tester because let's be honest, the testers aren't cheap. They're not like the $20 validation tester. I was on TikTok this morning and somebody had a Harbor Freight tester. They said he paid $50 for it. I'm like, you get what you pay for.
Yeah.
You get what you pay for. And they asked me, well, you need to have a $10,000 tester. And I said, well, if you want to certify something, yeah, absolutely you do. So testers are a huge, significant investment for most companies, and most companies don't buy a tester for everybody. They buy just a few of them, and so they got to start thinking about, well, how are we going to maintain this thing? Because they need to be calibrated, right?
Yeah.
And when you calibrate that tester and you're taking out of the field, that impacts your schedule. It impacts your workers and stuff like that, right? It impacts the operations. And then I've always said that at least once a quarter, that if you have a bunch of testers, you need to randomly pull them in out of the field and just do a QA inspection on them. Are all the heads there, both the channel heads there? Look inside the heads, make sure the pins aren't bent.
Yeah.
Look at the permanent link heads, make sure that they're not, not damaged. Yeah. When was the last time it's been updated? Because if you don't have a good foundation, and you know this, Steve, I know I'm preaching to the choir, Steve.
Oh, yeah.
If you don't have a good foundation, everything built on that foundation is worthless.
You're absolutely right. And it's, you talk about that training part of this, making sure they understand how to use the instrument, because that's paramount in any piece of test equipment you're using, whether it's a certifier, whether it's a cable locator or anything else. If you are not familiar with how to operate that piece of equipment, then you're going to have problems in the field. It's not something that you want to try and be learning on the fly in the middle of a job where time equals money. So, and we include training free of charge with our testers. Most manufacturers will train you on their product, and they always tell you, read the manual. Everybody, but we all know in the real world how many people will sit down and read cover to cover a manual. There are a few people who might, if I'm bored, I might grab a glass of wine in the evening and sit there and read through a manual on something if I need to understand it a little better. But most people just they want to get in it and go.
Yep. Here's a pro tip for you, Steve. So when for the contractors out there, so when you get that brand spanking new tester, take that owner's manual, put it in the file cabinet behind you, download the PDF, print it off, and put the PDF in the tester case. That way you have a backup copy. 2 is 1, 1 is none.
That's right. Exactly. And the way smartphone technology is now, you can put a copy of that on your smartphone too, and keep that PDF in the smartphone. So
that works for the younger guys, but us old guys like me, yeah, I'm gonna get a bigger phone that's got a bigger screen, and so I can actually read them
Zoom.
on there.
Pinching, yeah, you got to zoom in. Yeah.
Exactly.
So, another thing that it came to mind for me with some things that I learned over time is, and this kind of for big jobs, your scope of work is all laid out, and everything is specified pretty tightly, and you do have changes. Customers will request changes, but for the more the small to medium sized jobs, you might not have as big of a scope of work. There's going to be a contract, but one of the things you have to do is stay in communication with the customer. As the installer or the designer, installer, or integrator, stay in touch with the customer, because if they have minor changes they want, maybe this wall outlet they want 3 feet over for whatever reason, they change their office furniture. But you need to be in communication with them so that they know when you're getting ready to do things, and if they have something they want changed, that's communicated properly, and they understand the additional charges that are going to be incurred with things like that. So it's always good to maintain that tight communication with that customer, before the installation, the design phase, through the installation, and then of course in the wrap up at the end.
Oh, absolutely. I read an article once in Cable Installation and Maintenance magazine, and if you don't subscribe to that, you should. It's a great magazine.
Absolutely.
And it was a few years ago, and I've slept since then. So please don't ask me exactly when I read it, because I do read a lot. And they said that the number one reason a project loses money is because they change the project manager in the middle of the project. Right?
Oh.
And so here's another pro tip for contractor stuff listening. Because a lot of companies, one individual will estimate the project, another individual is going to run that project. Have a kickoff meeting before the project starts. Now, a kickoff meeting can be a full formal sit down in a conference room, somebody bring the donuts, if it's a big project. But a small project, 5 cable, 10 cable, it could be a phone call. That way there's a clear understanding of what was bid and what's actually that we're going to encounter out on the job site. Because quite often, by the time a project is awarded, from the time it gets out there, no, Steve, that could be weeks, sometimes months. And on new construction, site conditions have changed, and it's ripe for change order things, right?
Oh, yeah.
Pro tip, what am I up to? Is this number 3 now, I think? Pro tip number 3, I think.
You're asking me to count now.
We're on a tester show. We got to talk about testers, right?
Yeah.
Have a sign-out process for your testers so you know where they all are, right? And then that way, if there's an issue, you know who has it or stuff like that. Because, again, there's significant investments. Right?
Exactly. I'm kind of thinking on the fly here, relative to what you're talking about with the tester and the training and who's got it and making sure they're updated and everything. Regardless of whether you have our tester or somebody else's, you should register your test product with the manufacturer, because when you register that product, whenever they have firmware updates, software updates, things like that, you're made aware of it. It's not, manufacturers don't, I'm going to say they don't just use that for marketing stuff, because they're going to use it. They're going to send you information about new stuff. But the most important thing is you get updated when there's information about the product you're using, and you need to update your tester. So it's a good practice to make sure that you register that equipment.
Yeah, because the requirements for the testing are driven by the standards, and you and I both know those committees are always changing things. And those changes get reflected in the software updates. So
exactly,
having the latest software updates can ensure that when you submit those test results to that manufacturer for warranty purposes, you have a better chance of them accepting those test results. Because one of the things, I can speak this because my day job is I work for a manufacturer. One of the things we look at is, when was the last time that thing had a software update?
Yep.
That's one of the things we look at.
Yep, exactly. And most of the manufacturers know what the current version is, because they typically will have one of those testers in their lab. That's how we gain approvals from manufacturers, is they have a piece of test equipment. All the manufacturers are the same. Get a piece of their test equipment in the lab. They have to put it through rigorous testing before they'll grant that approval. So they're familiar with the equipment. They're familiar with what version of firmware and software might be out there. So it's good to keep your stuff up to date.
Yep, absolutely.
One thing, and this is kind of, off topic with testing, but it kind of relates to testing. Be aware of how much pulling force you're using when you're installing. And this goes back to like square one. Probably one of the questions that every single RCDD out there had on the exam was the pulling tension for Cat 5e or Cat 6 or 6a. And it's kind of on a tangent here a little bit. Fiber you can pull with a lot more force because you're actually not attaching to the glass itself. You're attaching to the strength members and the combination of the strength members and jacket and et cetera. But with the copper, especially when you're pulling it in, if you pull it with too much force or it goes through too many 90s and it creates additional force on there, what happens is you end up changing that geometry. And now the pair geometry is changed, and this is going to show up in your test results. You're going to see crosstalk issues and things like that. So it's always good to be mindful, during the installation of how much pulling strength you're using, and resist that human urge that if you're pulling and all of a sudden it feels like it's stuck, the right thing to do is not to put your foot on the wall and just yank as hard as you can on that cable to pull it through, because you've just exceeded that pulling tension.
Oh, absolutely. I did a project once where some guys that actually were pulling some outside plant cable. By the way, the pro tip number 4, that knot is called a half hitch. It's called a biting knot. But you didn't know that, did you?
No.
So anyway, we did a project in Miami, and the guys actually pulled the cable through the conduit system with an F-150 pickup truck. Ooh. And couldn't understand why half the strand didn't pass.
Ooh.
Oops.
Ooh.
Yeah, exactly. And you're talking about the pulling tension, because we all know it's 25 pounds or 50 pounds if it's fiber, right?
Right.
So one of the questions I get asked quite often, and I've never really had a good answer. Even when I went through my Bixie trainer class, I asked the trainers that, how do you measure that? And one person, well, you take a fish scale and you put it on and you pull it. Okay, so is that 25 pounds? Is it for one cable? What if I have 5 cables? Is it 25 times 5? And so my whole thing is exactly what you said. As long as it's pulling smoothly, it's not kinking, it's not catching, and you're not having to, feel like you're doing a workout, then you're probably within range.
And they make these things called breakaway swivels. And I don't know that I've ever seen them for the 25 pound, but they do have breakaway swivels that once you get to a certain pulling tension, that swivel will disconnect. So it won't let you exceed that pull force. Yes. So those do exist. I don't know if they exist for 25 pounds. Maybe they do. Maybe one of our attendees here has an idea if they've seen those out there. But yeah, that is one method of doing it. When you're pulling heavier cables, obviously you'd have if you're using a cable puller, you're going to have a force gauge on the cable puller so that you don't exceed that force. And when you start to use equipment for pulling cable, that is one of the most dangerous things that you can do in our industry is pulling cable. And you have to be very careful. If you are using a cable puller, make sure the rope is rated 4 times what that puller is rated for. You don't want to just hook up some nylon rope to a puller and try and pull your cable in, because when it snaps, it's going to come screaming out of that pipe at you. And
that's a potential for an injury right there.
It sure is.
Absolutely,
it sure is
a potential for an injury.
Yep.
The Kellums grips, as you mentioned earlier, you can buy them with the rated breakaway heads, and when I mention those in my classes and stuff, I usually get pushback from them. Well, if it breaks, then we got to pull the cable back out and restage it. Trust me, that's a lot more cost advantageous and schedule advantageous than having to call your project manager and say, "Hey, boss, remember that 50 pair that fiber optic cable that we had to wait so long for it to come in? I broke it."
Yeah, exactly. Or another thing related to fiber, when you're hooking up that grip, I've seen people just hook the grip to the jacket of the fiber and pull it in without attaching to the strength members or anything else. And what happens is now you get it all installed and you go to test it and you're having loss problems on the fiber. And you can't figure out, the connectors look good, everything looks good, you can't figure it out, and you hook up an OTDR to it, and all of a sudden now you're finding you've got some anomalies in the fiber. And what happened was you created what we used to call wavy fiber, where you're pulling the jacket, but the fiber actually bunches up under the jacket, and it creates a loss issue. And with fiber loss, as soon as if the connectors look good and it's failing, they're going to start calling the tester manufacturer. They go, hey, your tester's not working.
How many phone calls have you gotten where they say your tester's not working right?
Yeah, exactly. And with fiber, 9 times out of 10, if the fiber's failing, it's dirt. They haven't cleaned the connectors. But if everything else, you've gone through all these things and tried to troubleshoot the fiber and you can't figure out why it's failing, get an OTDR and shoot it. Maybe you've got micro bends, macro bends. Maybe you've got something else going on with the fiber. And the wavy fiber is a good example. That causes problems.
So you already mentioned tier 2 testing. I know what the stance is from my day job. How do you feel tier 1 versus tier 2? If you have a preference, you're writing the specs for a job, which are you going to spec out, tier 1 or tier 2?
Well, I'm going to spec tier 1 because my tester's tier 1. It doesn't have an OTDR on it. But just from talking to contractors in the field, most of the people I've talked to in the field, what they use OTDRs for 9 times out of 10 is troubleshooting. When they have a problem, they can't figure it out. As far as the scope of work goes, yeah, it gives you a blueprint, if you will, of the cable, which is good. It's good to see that. But the reality is, if it passes a tier 1 optical loss test, chances are that fiber is in excellent shape and you don't have a problem. Because if you had a problem, you would have grabbed an OTDR to try and troubleshoot that anyway. And I've actually seen people talk about, well, I'm just going to use the OTDR because it'll show me the loss. And while an OTDR will show you loss, it's a reflective event loss at each of those. It's not an optical loss test. It's a very different test than an optical loss test system where you're using a light source at one end and a power meter at the other. And it's very important for people to understand that an OTDR does not replace an optical loss test system. You still have to do that tier 1 test. That's required by the standards. Tier 2 is an option.
Yeah, a lot of technicians. And I get this in class a lot because one day I'm going to have to sit down and figure out how many people I've actually had in a class. I used to track it, and I quit at 10,000. So I know. But one thing I always get is tier 2 testing is better. Depends. Just like you said, it depends. Are you trying to troubleshoot something? If I'm trying to troubleshoot, I'm not going to use a tier 1 tester because it's not going to tell me where that loss is coming from. It's just going to tell me I have too much. Right. And a tier 2 tester is perfect. You can take cursor, you get in on that event and see it and stuff. And a lot of customers are actually requiring what's called spool testing or reel testing. And that's because stuff would get damaged during shipping and then the contractor wouldn't catch it. They'd pull the cable in, and then next thing you know, when they go to test it, they have some broken strands and they say, well, it must have been from the trucking company. And the trucking said, no, it must have been from you guys because you didn't write anything on the bill of lading that said that something was damaged. And it left the customer holding the bag. Yep.
And I do recommend anybody that's doing fiber, there's some basic things that you want to have in your kit. You've got your optical loss test set because you have to do that per the standards. You need to have a visual fault locator. If it's not built into your test set like ours is, you have one separate. Have an inspection scope, whether it works with your unit or it's a standalone inspection scope, because you got to inspect it, clean it if you need to, and inspect it again before you connect it to anything. So, and then lastly, of course, an OTDR. Anybody that's doing a lot of fiber work, you really need to have an OTDR in your arsenal. It doesn't have to be part of your certification system. It could be a separate OTDR because you're using it mostly for troubleshooting. And if you get a job that requires tier 2, there's nothing in that tier 2 that says that same instrument has to do both tests. You can provide the OTDR traces and you can provide the loss testing as 2 separate reports, and it still qualifies as your tier 2.
Oh, absolutely. Here's pro tip number 4. We need to do a count thing on pro tips I give out today, right? If you have an inspection scope or you're looking to buy one, make sure you buy one that gives you the ability to take a digital picture of the end face and make that part of your documentation package.
Right.
Because the 3 most important things in our industry are documentation, and documentation.
Exactly.
When in doubt, document some more. And it's funny because we work in the communications industry. What do we suck at?
Communicating. Yeah, you're right. I think that's a global thing. It's in every industry, I think, that experiences. But you'd think those of us in the communications industry would be experts at communicating everything, but it doesn't always happen.
You would think. You're in the communications industry.
Yeah,
Yeah, no, no.
exactly.
Even with the simple stuff, like when I send when I was sending out invites to come to classes and stuff, and I send it to the supervisors, and the supervisors tell the technicians to be at the class, and they show up to class and they don't have their tools. I'm like, it said right on the sheet to bring your tools and stuff, and
Exactly. Exactly. So any other words of wisdom before we see if Jacqueline's got any questions teed up for us?
how much time do you have?
We got about 5 minutes, I think.
How about this one? In learning, you teach. In teaching, you learn. There's my words.
Amen. Amen. At every class I've ever taught, I've learned something. I never stopped learning. Doing things like this, I'm always learning. It's something that we need to be aware of. Some people refer to people who've been in the industry a long time. Oh yeah, we're experts. Everybody's an expert in something, but we all have to keep learning. It's not, none of us knows everything. So it's something that we have to keep in front of us. And that's something I've found, in like teaching classes, teaching people how to use the products that our company makes. And in my previous role, teaching people how to do all kinds of different testing of cables and cable locating and things like that. I always learn every time I do it.
Yes. And we also learn from our mistakes. Don't forget that. A lot of people they beat themselves over mistakes. A mistake is only an issue if you don't learn from it.
It's an opportunity to learn.
Exactly right.
Exactly.
Exactly.
So, so it looks like, which is better, one jumper or two jumper references. So this is fiber related. So the standards will allow you to do both. And a quick explanation, if anybody isn't aware of the difference between a one jumper and two jumper method. So with a dual ended tester, each unit has a light source and a power meter. So you're going from light source on one to a power meter on the other and vice versa. So when we refer to one jumper versus two jumper, it means when you set the reference, you've got one jumper from the light source to the power meter. So on the main, one from the light source to the remote power meter, and then from the remote, one from that light source back to the main power meter, and you set your reference. So that's called a single jumper method. The two jumper method, you have a reference cable attached to the light source port and a reference cable attached to the power meter port, and you have a coupler, a bulkhead in between them, and you set the reference. Now, while both are acceptable in the standards, the one jumper method is preferred. And the reason is when you couple two together and you set that reference, you're essentially referencing out that mating point. And then when you disconnect those, one of those goes to each end of the fiber under test. And now you could potentially reference out one of the, if the end of the fiber you're testing has the same exact loss as the one you just referenced out, it's going to show zero loss when you really do have loss there. So you can mask loss using that single jumper. So the single jumper is definitely a preferred method, although both are acceptable. And there are certain situations where you can't get away from it. If you're trying to go between series connectors and things like that, you can't get away from that.
I got a question for you, Steve, and I get asked this question all the time in class, and it's tester specific. It really is. And so one of the things we got to do is we got to make sure that we allow the light source to stabilize before we start testing the fiber, right? What do you recommend for AEM test equipment? How long do you recommend you leave it on to stabilize before you start zeroing out your equipment?
That's a great question. So you want to let it sit for 5 minutes. There are other manufacturers out there that take about 10 minutes.
Yes, that's what I said.
And with ours, it's 5. And if you try to set reference before that 5 minutes is up, it will tell you. You need to wait, and it'll tell you how many seconds you got left. So the reason behind that is you want to let the electronics warm up so that they stabilize. And it's now if you've left your tester out in sub-zero temperatures overnight, you probably want to bring it into the building and have it warm up a little bit before you even try to do any of that. But normal temperatures, even winter temperatures, 5 minutes is typically plenty of time.
Okay. Pro tip number 5. Do not leave your test equipment in your vehicle overnight. Bring them into the house, secure them, then take them out to the truck and then drive to your job site.
Especially anything with an LCD display.
Oh yes, and especially if you live up in the north where it freezes.
Minnesota.
Yeah. Well, actually, you can have that here. You and I both live in Florida.
You
can overheat something pretty quickly.
You can overheat
here in Florida.
Yep, you can. Absolutely. Yeah. If it's 95 degrees outside, it's probably 130 or 140 in your car. So
how many times have you had a phone that said, "I'm shutting down because I'm overheated"?
Yeah. Oh, exactly. So I wonder if we have any more questions, or are we getting right up at our time probably? So I think we're right at about 30 minutes. And Chuck, I really appreciate you coming on the show this week.
My pleasure.
And it was a pleasure having you. Always enjoy talking to you, whether it's on one of our podcasts or just chatting offline. It's always good to catch up.
Same here.
So really appreciate it. And thanks everybody for attending today. And we will see you next week on Tech Talk Tuesday at noon.